It is a real honor and privilege to be here, especially here at St. Paul Seminary on the Feast of the Conversion of St. Paul, and standing here to talk about Catholic religious education between the two patron saints of Catholic education. I don't know if all of you know, there's a relic of each of these saints, St. John Neumann and St. Elizabeth Ann Seton, right next to their statues there. So you may want to take a few minutes to pray afterwards, especially if you're a Catholic school teacher. It might be a good opportunity to pray. And I meant that the way it sounded. I am excited to talk tonight about a topic that kind of brings together two fields that I've been deeply involved in my work in child psychology as well as my work in catechesis. Most of my work today is now in the area of Catholic religious education. So I serve as associate publisher at OSV Publishing, which is the largest publisher in the English language of Catholic books and curriculum. And I oversee the development of our curriculum for kids. And so we have some early childhood curriculum, 1st through 8th grade curriculum, and sacramental prep and other things like that. And really trying to make an effort to integrate what we know today about kids and their development and how they grow and how they learn and best practices for education, to integrate all of that with our religious education. I was mentioning to somebody at the table this evening that what I find is that even though the field of education, general education, tends to be a few years behind the research, and necessarily so, because it takes a while for things to get from the ivory towers of academia to be put into practice in a more practical setting. We know so much more about the brain and how it grows and how people learn, and all of the brain imaging advances that have been made in recent years have really contributed to that. We know so much more than we used to, but we use very little of that when it comes to religious education, both in our Catholic schools and in our parishes. Our religious education looks very much like it did decades ago. And for me, that's a shame. Obviously our subject matter is timeless, right? So the content ought not to change quite that much. But the way that we deliver that content, and even the timing in which we deliver that content, needs to be keeping up with the research on what we know. And what I'm happy to share and excited to share with you today is what we've learned about when might be the particular periods of time that are most advantageous to present particular content in religious education. And I'll talk about some theorists that are familiar to you and how neuroscience has borne out some of those educational theories and what that means for us as religious educators. But I'd like to begin with a couple of questions just for you to reflect on. We're not going to really talk very much about this, but I'd like you to be thinking about this as we go through the presentation tonight. Number one, what is your earliest memory of an experience of faith? So what's the first thing that you remember learning about God or about your faith? And then second, how has your understanding of God and faith changed over time? Hopefully you're in a different place than you might have been as a young child in your understanding of God, especially if you're teaching others. I would assume that you're in a different place than you were. But how has your understanding of God and faith changed over time? I think it's very important for us to reflect on this as religious educators, because I think sometimes we'd like for, whether in a parish setting, the children and teens and adults that we work with there, or in a school setting, the young people that we're working with, our students there, we'd love for them to get it all at once. But that's not really how it happens, is it? How has that grown and changed over time? And then I have a pressing question for us to really think about tonight. Are we indeed forming people for a lifelong practice of the faith and celebration of the sacraments? Because the one thing that's very different about religious education as a subject area in Catholic schools, or catechesis as it's presented in the parish, is that this is not just a cognitive exercise. This is not just information that we hope to learn and master just for the sake of intellectual curiosity. This is something that we're called to live, right? St. James says faith without works is what? Is dead. Right? And so are we forming people for a lifelong practice of the faith and celebration of the sacraments? A 2015 study by the Pew Research Center indicates that 42% of adults in the United States have left the faith of their childhood. That number is slightly higher for Catholics than for Protestants, by the way. And in the book Forming Intentional Disciples, Sherry Waddell points out that the lack of attachment to one's childhood faith is particularly significant among Catholics. I zeroed in on this word attachment because of my background in child development. You know, we think of attachment a lot and the implications for attachment on relationship, right? And I'm going to come back to that. So hold that thought. Before the pandemic, only 22% of Catholics attended Mass weekly. That number is now down to 17%. So 17% of people that identify as Catholics attend Mass on a weekly basis, which I think most of us would agree is, you know, part of the definition of even the minimal practice of the faith, right? It's one of the precepts of the church. You know, at minimum, we ought to be going to Mass once a week on Sundays. And so I think it's important for us to think about what's going on there and how can we be more effective at forming people for a lifelong practice of the faith and for intentional discipleship. So as we talk about this, I'm going to be referring to a lot of different aspects of child and adolescent development. And I think it's important for us to recognize development is multifaceted. By the way, I realize that there's a lot of words on some of these slides. And so I want to mention to you that if you find that my slides are just far too frustrating, you can do two things. One, I would recommend you're free to move closer because there's space up here in the front. And the second is I'll give you my email address at the end, and I'm happy to send you a copy of my notes from this evening as well. So I want you to just kind of feel, you know, many of us have just had dinner downstairs. Is that where we were? Yes, we were downstairs. Okay, I'm terrible with spatial memory and stuff, so I think we went downstairs. So many of us have just had dinner downstairs, so I want this to be, you know, a relaxed environment. Don't feel like you've got to, you know, jot down everything or anything like that. But development is multifaceted. So when we talk about child development, and I'm sure many of you know this because of your own backgrounds in education, we're talking about a lot of different things. We're talking about intellectual or cognitive development. We're talking about social development. How do kids learn to relate to others and peers and adults in their lives? Emotional development, and particularly emotional self-regulation. So how do we learn to regulate our own emotions and not just kind of, you know, go bananas every time something stressful happens? How do we learn how to regulate ourselves? Moral development. So how do we choose between what's right and what's wrong? How do we determine that? How do we make those choices and put that into action? And then spiritual development. What is our understanding of God and spirituality, and how do we grow in that way? So we'll talk about all of these different things as we go through here, but first I want to talk about something that really is connected to all of these things, because we can't do anything at all without a brain. Right? Everything we do behaviorally, everything we do mentally depends on the brain. Sometimes we just associate the brain with thought, but the brain really is everything. It's emotion, it's thought, it's movement. And brain development is contingent on a complex interaction between the genes and the environment. You know, there has for decades been kind of a raging debate among child development people that you know, is it mostly genes that determine our behavior and our outcomes, or is it mostly the environment? You know, is it nature or is it nurture? And science has by now really definitively answered this question, and the answer is yes. It's both. It's a complex interaction. between our genes and our physical environment, and much more environment than we sometimes give it credit for, right? And so, I mean, sometimes we see parents, for example, who are just really, really intelligent, and they'll have a kid who's really intelligent and excels, and we say, wow, he's got the genes. Well, he also has the environment, right? Because he's being raised by two parents who are probably buying lots of books and having stimulating conversations and all of those things. So there's a complex interaction between these things. One thing we know is that early experiences contribute significantly to the structure of the brain and its capacities. And those experiences, the importance of those experiences kind of rely on three variables: the quality, the quantity, and the consistency of stimulation, right? So we want a child to have a stimulating environment and lots of stimulating experiences, many stimulating experiences, consistent stimulating experiences, and quality experiences. Early interactions, how we relate and respond, directly affect how the brain is wired. Dr. Bruce Perry is kind of the guy that's the go-to guy for brain development today and how early experiences affect brain development. In fact, you might have seen Dr. Perry before on TV and not even known it, because when they have, a case of just horrific abuse where they find a child, who's been locked in a closet for 5 years or something like that, they typically have Dr. Perry on the national news talking about what does this do to the brain when a child suffers this kind of abuse and neglect, right? He's the expert on these things. I saw Dr. Perry speak one time, and I'll never forget one thing that he said. He said, you know how when you're like in line at the grocery store or something, and there's a baby kind of sitting there in the front of the basket, and the adult is facing the checker, but the baby is facing you, or maybe the person's holding the baby, right? And you're standing behind, and so the baby's looking at you, right? And babies, they don't know yet that it's not polite to stare, so they're kind of looking at you like, oh, I haven't seen this one before, right? And he said, when that happens, always smile at that baby. And he said the reason why is because when we give those kinds of reactions to babies, what we notice about what happens in the brain, we actually see new axons and dendrites growing together and forming new neural connections in the social and relatedness area of the brain. He said, when you wave and smile at that baby, you're actually helping their brain grow, that relationship area of the brain grow. And so now every time I always smile at the baby because, and you probably do too, right? But it's important because those early experiences really do affect how the brain is wired. And children learn best in the context of relationships. When you think of a teacher who really was formative in your life, right? One that really changed things for you, that you really learned a lot for. Picture that teacher in your mind. I bet it was somebody who you really felt a connection with too, right? It wasn't just, oh, this guy was just so brilliant and he said a lot of things that were really interesting. It's somebody that you connected with, right? Because children learn in the context of relationships. Also, it's important to point out that brain development is non-linear. So even though we do see stages that many kids go through in terms of their thinking and their brain development, we also see examples of kind of some scatter skills or some uneven development. My own daughter, we adopted just over 2 years ago, and she had, as you might imagine, because she was in the system, when we adopted her, quite a kind of a sketchy beginning and a lot of neglect. And we see a lot of uneven development there. Like there are some instances where she just astonishes us, like, wow, I can't believe I'm talking to a little kid. And then there are other times that we like, wait, you don't know about this yet. You don't know how to do this yet. And that's possible. Kids don't always learn everything in a certain order, and especially if they've had some of that uneven early history. But we do see, for most kids, particular windows of opportunity. And that's what we're here to talk about tonight. So let's talk about, oops, I need to go back one. Let's talk about what I mean by that a little bit. So do you remember those of you who have taken child development courses, do you remember studying a Russian developmental theorist called Lev Vygotsky? Anybody remember Vygotsky, right? So what was the basis of Vygotsky's theory? It was that children have what he called zones of proximal development, where they are just primed to learn something, right? So one example might be kids learning to tie their shoe. You know, remember back when shoes had shoelaces and kids would tie them, they would learn how to tie them? When we were kids, some of us, that was the reality. Today, they just kind of learn how to do the Velcro. But back when kids learned how to tie shoes, right? So there was a point at which it would have been pointless to try to teach them to tie their shoes. 2-year-olds don't have the motor skills for tying shoes. We could sit with them all day and they probably wouldn't get it, right? No matter how, and they would just get frustrated, wouldn't they? They would just get frustrated, right? Now, fast forward that to about 6 years old, right? Or 5 even, right? We can sit with that child and we can show them the technique for, and they have the motor planning to do it and they have the fine motor skills to do it, right? But maybe they haven't mastered it yet. They have the fine motor skills and the motor planning, but they need someone to sit with them and show them how to do it. Maybe model it for them, right? That's a child who's in the zone of proximal development for shoe tying. They have the motor skills, they have the motor planning, but they need some support to learn how to do it, right? And that's what Vygotsky was talking about. So he observed this without knowing the structure of the brain, because back in his time, we had no brain imagery at all. We had no idea how the brain grew. We knew it grew, you know, the little baby head got bigger, but we didn't know anything about how it grew, right? Now we do. So Dr. Bruce Perry has identified a lot about how the brain grows, and one of the things that we know, and he calls this neurosequential development, is that the brain tends to grow from bottom to top, right? So when we're born, we need to have a working brain stem, or we can't survive. And the brain stem is you know, the basis of the most basic life-supporting functions, circulation and breathing and things like that. And as we move up into the brain, the next area is drives, hunger, thirst, sleep, things like that. We move a little further, the next area of the brain to grow and develop is the emotional center of the brain, the limbic system. And that's where our emotions develop, and also our attachments to people. So, you know, attachment begins to develop very early in life. We expect that by the end of the first year that an infant will be showing signs of attachment to a primary caregiver, for instance, and probably also some secondary attachments as well. And as they get older, they're going to form more secondary attachments to others, including peers. And then the last area of the brain to grow, I don't know if I'm not always getting a little laser thing here, am I? Maybe my laser's wearing out. Okay, the last area of the brain to grow is, I'll just point to it, the cerebral cortex up here, which is responsible for all of our higher order thinking. And especially the very last area, the prefrontal cortex. That's responsible for impulse control, for all the executive functions. So being able to screen out things that aren't important, pay attention to relevant details, kind of determine what is the problem here that I need to tackle, how will I do that, kind of plot that course of action, then what are the consequences afterwards, you know, how will it go, and then evaluating those consequences. It might not surprise you then to know that the prefrontal cortex is the area of the brain that we tend to see some problems in development in kids with ADHD, right? Because they're not great at some of that stuff, impulse control and paying attention to relevant things and stuff like that. We see a little less development, less activity in kids with ADHD. The good news is we discovered just a few years ago that many of those kids, it's just a different kind of trajectory of development. And so many of them, their brains catch up. It's kind of like how some kids get taller before others and then eventually they even out. So that's why we see some kids that you know, take stimulant medication, which increases activity in the prefrontal cortex for a few years so they can make most efficient use of what they have there. But then after a while, they don't have to do that anymore. Now they've gained some more impulse control. It's not because the medication cured them, it's just because their brain development caught up. So the brain tends to grow bottom to top, And during that time, we see particular windows of opportunity. Um, so Dr. Pam Schiller at the University of Houston took Dr. Bruce Perry's work and his brain imaging work and applied that to particular areas of development. And we see in those areas of development some optimal windows and next best opportunities. And I'll talk about one optimal window and next best opportunity that you're probably very familiar with, and that's attachment. So when those attachment researchers like Ainsworth and Bowlby talked about early infant attachment, one of the things that they identified was that that first year of life was a pretty critical period. In fact, they thought it was an absolutely critical period. Now we would describe it more as a sensitive period, right? So we want kids to, if possible, to form an attachment to a primary caregiver in that first year of life. But if for some reason that doesn't happen, maybe there's some severe neglect, or maybe there's some illness on the part of the primary caregiver, or something is going on, that we have the next best opportunity, because the attachment relationship area of the brain is still growing rapidly in those first 5 or 6 years of life. So in early childhood, we have the next best window. So the optimal window for attachment would be 0 to 12 months. The next best opportunity would be from 1 year to 5 years, say, right? So then you have some other examples here. Emotional intelligence, optimal window in those first 2 years of life because of the relationship of this to attachment and the attachment area of the brain. Next best opportunity, 2 to 5 years. And further rewiring is still possible at any age. Motor development, optimal window in those first couple of years. I have a sister who was adopted from China at about 13 months of age, and she was from a mountainous region in China and an orphanage way up in the mountains without good heat. And so they would swaddle these little babies in layers and layers and layers of clothing. And she had very little opportunity, really, to exercise her arms and legs. And so she came over at 13 months. Not only could she not stand, like many kids do at 12 and 13 months, begin to take their first steps, not only could she not do that, she couldn't even roll over. And you know, she went through some physical therapy, and she was in that next best window of opportunity at 2 to 5 years. By the time she was 6 and 7 years old, she was, you know, in dance and excelling there and swimming and all kinds of things. Because that rewiring was still possible. Now, if I wanted to learn a new sport, I wanted to be an Olympic gold medalist at my age, and decided, you know, I'm going to learn this and I'm going to go all the way. People would say, that is crazy, because there's no way I'm going to do it, right? I'm not young enough for that kind of rewiring, you know, and so it decreases with age. We see a similar phenomenon with vision, with early sounds, with music. You know, there's further rewiring possible past those early ages, but early age is better. Thinking skills, and especially development of the prefrontal cortex. We know now from a lot of research that's been done at Yale University and other leading centers of research in early childhood that the higher order thinking skills that develop in the prefrontal cortex are very dependent on being able to have child-initiated, child-directed play in the preschool years. That's one reason why we're seeing a rise of ADHD and problems with impulse control in our culture today, because our preschool education has moved from education where kids can freely choose activities and have a stimulating environment to do that in, and kind of guide themselves through their play, to education that looks like a little first grade classroom, but now for 3-year-olds, where they sit and they work on worksheets and the teacher leads it all day. What we know is that that's actually hazardous for the brain. And we also know that those kids underperform as 4th graders. Why do they underperform as 4th graders when they've been through that kind of early education, that academic kind of preschool? Because they haven't developed the prefrontal cortex of the brain. 4th grade is kind of that magic year, and those of you who are in school environments know this, where learning becomes much more self-directed. We depend on those 4th graders to do more independent reading, more independent writing. Because they didn't build the architecture for directing their own activities in preschool, those fourth graders tend to underperform versus the fourth graders that had a much more child-initiated, child-directed preschool environment. So if you're at a Catholic school, one thing we know is that the most rapidly growing age group in Catholic schools is preschool, that many Catholic schools are adding early childhood classrooms. Please, please, please get an early childhood teacher to run that program and not an elementary education teacher. And please, please, please don't make it an academic environment. Make it an environment that we know really encourages that brain development that those kids will need in fourth grade. This is pretty critical. And I've been in a lot of Catholic schools where I've done observations as a psychologist where the 3-year-old classroom looks a lot like the first grade classroom. So we need to be thinking about this. Okay, so you get the sense of the windows of opportunity here. Now I'm going to talk about what we know about development at a few different ages along the age span and the windows of opportunity that gives, and this is the really exciting stuff for me. So what can we say about how we should be teaching the faith and what topics of faith we should talk about at different ages based on the windows of opportunity that we're given there in development? So in early childhood, in those preschool years, there's a lot of family restructuring going on. There's a lot of, in those years, couples have gone from not having kids to having kids. They've gone from mostly hanging out with people that don't have kids to hanging out with other young families. They're looking for that kind of support, and they're building new connections. Very often in parishes, this is the time that we have absolutely nothing for them. We give them baptism classes, and they say, come back when they're in school, and we'll start them in religious ed. We need to be rethinking that, and one reason is because we want parents to be involved. But when we don't bring them in as young parents, when they're not accustomed to having a community of faith from the very beginning of parenthood, then it feels a little more contrived to them now at First Communion to say, okay, now we want you to connect with each other. We want you to come, here and gather with your children at the parish. It feels awkward to them because they're not used to doing this anymore. So we need to be thinking about that for that reason. But the other reason that we need to be thinking about it is, remember when Sherry Waddell said that adults in the United States aren't particularly attached to their faith? And one way we know that is that 42% of adults have left the faith of their childhood. Actually, the number is 53%, but 9% come back, right? So we are always hoping that they'll come back, maybe when they have kids or something. Well, 9% do. The other 42% never come back. And she concluded from that adults in the United States aren't very attached to their faith. Well, remember when attachment happens, right? So the optimal window for attachment and relationship is when that attachment and relationship area of the brain is growing at its fastest, when it has the most, what we call neuroplasticity, when it's most moldable, right? And those are in the first 5 or 6 years of life. So if we baptize a child as an infant, and then we say, come back when they're ready for First Communion, we've completely missed that window. And so what stage are they in at that point? That's when the prefrontal cortex is really the center of brain growth. That's when kids are learning lots of new words and lots of facts and figures and things like that, and they can memorize stuff. That's why we like to have them at that age in religious ed. They can remember stuff, right? They can learn the new vocabulary, right? But here's the problem. We might end up with kids who come in at first or second grade, even if they go all the way to high school, learn lots of facts about the faith, and then graduate high school and leave the faith. I bet you've never encountered a kid who's done that. It happens all the time, doesn't it? So what happened there? We always go, gosh, they were in so many years of religious, it must be the teacher's fault. Or it must be those catechists. Or maybe it's those stinking books. They're just not like they used to be when they had the Baltimore Catechism. Maybe that's what it is. No, you know what it is? It's because they learned a lot about the faith when the cerebral cortex was growing really fast. They learned a lot of facts, but were they ever attached to Jesus and the church, right? What is our best window for attaching kids to Jesus and the church? Our best window is in those first 6 years of life. So how closely are we walking with these young parents? How much are we involving young kids in the parish in their first community experience of faith, right? Are they attaching to Jesus and to the church in those moments? Can they become attached later? Absolutely they can. You know, St. Augustine wasn't really attached until he was an older adult, right? And he became one of our greatest saints. Absolutely, it's possible, right? Just like it was possible for my daughter, who was adopted at age 8, to become attached to her mom and me, right? It's possible. But when is it easiest? When is it most efficient and most effective? It's most effective in infancy, right? It's easiest then. And it's a little more easy than later on in those early childhood years. But the older they get, the less easy it gets. And we might end up with kids who learn a lot about their faith, but never were really attached. So for this reason, I really believe that early childhood is the most important period in religious education. I think we need to be paying a lot more attention in our parishes and schools on these preschool years. And what do we need to focus on in those years? So there are a lot of early childhood religion curricula that are out there. Some of them are just kind of collections of Bible stories that people thought would be cute to teach kids at this age. Some Bible stories and some activities about those Bible stories and stuff like that. But what should be the central subject matter? And if we want to attach them to Jesus and the church, it needs to be focused on the life of Jesus and on the church, the parish first, because that's their first experience of the church, right? And the family, the home, which is the domestic church. I would look for curricula that focuses on those things. I would also look for curricula that allows for some child-initiated activities, for them to guide themselves through some of the material and be agents of their own formation, because we know that's most effective with preschool-age kids, with preschool-age kids especially. It engages them. We are wired to want to learn. I mean, it's only the way that we do education that stamps that out of kids. But we're wired to be curious and to want to learn. And if we can do education in such a way that it encourages that curiosity and allows them to explore, then they'll continue to want to learn. You see down here the God, gene, and attachment. A few years ago, there was kind of a big announcement that made the popular news. Sorry, allergies are horrible right now for me. It's mold that I'm most allergic to. It was rainy in Austin when I left, and it was wet here, and so I apologize. Sniffling a lot. That mold is growing. A few years ago, there was a big announcement in the news that a researcher had been looking at, well, one thing that they found was that the brains of people who were very religious look a little bit different from the brains of people who aren't. I thought, there are structural differences in the brain between people who are religious and people who aren't. What is that about? Well, there was a geneticist named Dr. Dean Hammer who looked into this. And of course, if you're a geneticist, what are you going to think about brain differences? There must be a gene for that, right? So he started looking for the gene, and he identified a gene that he thought accounted for the difference. It's abbreviated the VMAT2 gene, and he nicknamed it the God gene. Remember hearing about the God gene in the news? Well, Carl Zimmer and some other folks kind of looked critically at his research and found that not only did it not account for very much of the variance, which is a no-no in research, not only did it really not account for very much of the variance between those two groups, the religious and the non-religious, also it was very hard to replicate. Another no-no in research. I'm here in an academic setting, so I know you understand this. And so this is kind of garbage science. So you'll be relieved to know there's no God gene, right? What I think really accounts for the difference in the brains of the people who are very religious and the people that aren't is the development of that area of the brain that's responsible for attachment and the way that people become attached to God and their Christian community or not, right? Because remember that brain development is not only related to genes, but also on those early experiences, changes how the brain is wired, right? It changes the very structure of the brain. Okay, I'm not going to be able to spend as much time on all the other age groups as I did on early childhood, but I think it's appropriate given the importance of early childhood. So we've already talked about the importance of hands-on active learning, child-initiated experiences. We want to, of course, make in preschool their experience, any kind of educational experience, imaginative and fun, needs to be multimedia and multisensory, right? Preschool kids don't learn best from books and worksheets. They learn best by doing, right? I would argue that probably also second and third and fourth graders learn best by doing, and maybe even adults. But for now, we'll talk about preschoolers. They certainly learn best by doing. I'm going to move on, though, to the first grade child. You can get my notes, remember, later if you'd like them. So first graders, they're beginning to move into a cognitive stage of rule-based thinking. How many of you have ever either are a first grade teacher or have substitute taught in a first grade classroom? Anybody? So what happens if you substitute in a first grade classroom? This is the interesting thing. If you substitute in a first grade classroom, but you do something different from what the teacher usually does, it's painful for them, isn't it? Oh, this is not how we do it, teacher. You know, this is what we do, right? Because they are very concrete. They like to know the rules. In fact, they organize their world according to rules, right? They're also notorious tattletales, you know? So a kid could be across the room getting into something he's not supposed to. Can the kid over here ignore it? They notice, teacher, it's painful again. He's getting into that thing. And why? Why are they notorious tattletales? Because their world is organized according to rules. And so if somebody's breaking the rules, the world is falling apart just a little bit, right? We got to bring it back together, right? And so this is kind of, you know, they're very concrete. They're learning cause and effect and all of those kinds of things. And so it's a great time to offer them some of the basic teachings of the faith on a first grade level, of course. Because it's the beginning of formal religious education for many children, and because the aim of catechesis is communion and intimacy with Jesus, it's logical also to focus first grade catechesis around the person of Jesus, especially if they didn't get it as preschoolers. If they didn't kind of form that attachment then, our next best opportunity is in first grade. So we got to really try hard to do that as well. First graders are just beginning to move beyond that developmental self-focus that we call egocentrism in preschoolers, which is perfectly normal and good in preschoolers for them to think that the whole world revolves around them. Unfortunately, we also know some adults who think the whole world revolves around them. That is not developmentally appropriate in an adult, but it is appropriate in a preschooler. As they move into first grade, some of them are beginning to move on beyond that developmental self-focus, and so an introduction to relationship with Jesus and the church community is appropriate for them. In second grade, you know, kids at this age are in that, and I know you're familiar with Piaget stages too, they're very firmly in what we would call that concrete operations stage. They realize the world works according to cause and effect. I have a little magic trick that I do with kids that I see, and where I can make something small disappear and then reappear. You've seen those kinds of sleight of hand tricks, right? And I'm pretty good at it because I was in practice as a psychologist with kids for over 20 years. So I mastered some of these little techniques, right? Even the adults didn't quite see what happened there. But, you know, the preschoolers would see that and they'd be like, wow, Dr. White is magic, right? But what did the 7-year-olds say? Did they say, wow, Dr. White is magic? No, they asked me one question. What was the question? How'd you do that, right? Because they know things don't just disappear and reappear. They know the world works according to rules, right? And so they knew there must be a trick to it. How did you do that? I want to know that trick, right? And that's the difference in that kind of thinking. This is why we call this age the age of reason. This is why, you know, kids this age are at what we would call the catechetical age. Sometimes people call it that. This is why the church in her wisdom says we need to wait until at least around this time to introduce kids to the sacrament of penance and then Eucharist, because now they're in that age of reason. It's a great time to introduce God's rules and guidelines for living because they're very concerned with the rules anyway, right? But when they begin to learn God's rules for our living, if we teach it in a way that's developmentally appropriate, what do they start to understand when they hear that? I've done some lessons on the Ten Commandments with second graders, and if you do it well, and you kind of teach it on a second grade level, what does it mean as a second grader to follow this commandment? I mean, obviously they can't really commit adultery in the most literal sense, right? But what does it mean as a second grader, to follow this commandment? If you teach it well, they kind of start squirming in their seats, and you see this look on their face, and the look is, oh no, I broke God's rules, right? I broke God's rules, right? And so that's why we offer them the sacrament of penance, right? It's not a punishment that comes up in second grade all of a sudden. It's a gift, right? You realize that the world works according to rules. You realize now that you haven't followed God's guidelines for your life, but he gives you the gift of forgiveness and the grace to do better and to keep growing, right? And so this is a good time, of course, to introduce that. And also because they've reached the age of reason, second graders are better able to understand that the Eucharist is not ordinary bread and wine, but it's the body and blood of Christ. But they don't understand it because they understand anything about transubstantiation. They can't even say the word transubstantiation. How do they understand it? Because Jesus said it. He said, this is my body, this is my blood, so therefore it's the rule, right? Jesus said it, right? So they believe it because Jesus, as they get older, they're going to understand even more deeply about what the Eucharist means. Second graders are concrete thinkers. They need a lot of hands-on activities, practical explanations. Our approach to teaching the sacraments should be step-by-step and very concrete. Have you ever dealt with, those of you who taught second graders or prepared kids for first penance, have you ever dealt with kids that are scared to go to confession? You know what will drastically reduce their fear about going to confession. That fear about going to confession is about 80 to 90% just the fear of the unknown, right? When they see most of them at confessional, they see a door. They have no idea what's going on in there, right? Second graders are also not very good at picturing something they've never seen before. So you can tell them what happens. There's a priest, you talk to the priest, you do this. They have no picture of it in their head. That's a second grader. It's very hard for them to picture something they've never seen before, right? If you take them inside the confessional, and you say, this is where we sit, that's where Father sits, and say even more than that. Say you act it out, right? You have one of the catechists play the priest and the other one play the penitent, and you tell them, this is just pretend, he's not a priest, and I'm not really confessing my sins, it's just pretend, but we want to show you how this works. Even more clear picture reduces that anxiety drastically. So our approach to teaching the sacraments needs to be very concrete, very step by step. If we want them to understand the parts of the Mass, the best place to teach that would be where? In the church. In the church. And we can talk about what happens where. Or at least to have like a model of the church in the classroom. To talk about what happens here, what happens there, what's going on at different times in the Mass. Right? So this is an ideal time to learn the steps of the rite, the parts of the Mass, the basics of what the church teaches about the sacraments. In third grade, children this age have entered what the social developmental theorist Harry Stack Sullivan called the chumship stage, when same-age peers become very important, and kids often have best friends, right? Before third grade, a lot of times kids are connecting with peers around a particular activity. They go out on the playground, they choose who to play with based on what people are playing. I want to play Foursquare today, so I'm going to play with these two kids that are playing Foursquare. Well, I guess you need 3 more kids. These 3 kids that are playing Foursquare, right? Or I want to play soccer today, so I'm going to go over to the soccer field and play with those kids. Or I want to climb on the jungle gym. Do they still have those? I think they do. So I'm going to climb over here with these kids, right? But as they get into third grade, something really changes. Right? And the person they're with is more important than what they're doing. So I wanted to play Foursquare, but my best friend wanted to play soccer. And so we went and played soccer, right? Because I wanted to play with my best friend. And so, uh, because of this, now this focus on same-age peers, this is an ideal time, this is a window of opportunity to talk about the parish community and what Christian community means to us. Third graders are also more aware of the larger world. The world has become bigger for them, and now they're more aware of the world around them. So it's a good time to talk about the larger worldwide church and how it's organized. In fourth grade, something happens with respect to conscience formation and the development of morality. Fourth graders are beginning to internalize standards of behavior. Prior to this age, kids tend to make moral decisions based on whether something good happens when I do this or something bad happens. Do I get rewarded or do I get punished, right? It's a very utilitarian kind of approach to making choices, but it's normal at young ages. All of us know adults who still operate like that, right? Like, if nobody sees me when I steal this, then, no harm, no foul, right? But we would hope that they would develop differently from that, and this is the window of opportunity for the beginning of that, because they're just beginning to internalize standards of behavior, to get to a point where they're capable of thinking about what's right and what's wrong, even beyond the consequences, right? This is very important for the development of the ability to resist peer pressure, right? Because if everybody around you says, this is good, and now you're going to get punished for not doing that thing, that's a wrong thing to do because everybody around you thinks it's perfectly okay and wants you to do it too, then how do you make that choice? If you make it based on rewards and punishments, you'll go along with the group. If you make it based on internalized standards of behavior, you'll say, no, that's the wrong thing to do. And that's where we want them to be, right? They're not as capable of doing that before they get into, closer to this age, but they become much more capable as a fourth grader of internalizing those standards. And so we want to revisit morality and the development of conscience, and especially focus on things like the Beatitudes. What does it mean? What is the mindset of a disciple of Jesus, right? Fourth graders are good at using reasoning skills, but they still don't have a firm grasp on hypothetical reasoning. Even now, when we describe to them a situation that they've never been in, they have a really hard time picturing it, even at fourth grade, right? And so if we're talking about moral decision-making in the abstract, and we're saying, when your friends do this, what do you do? Maybe they learn how to do the right thing, but maybe they don't. A better approach to that would be to act out situations, right? So show me what is the right thing to do. When, say you're in the lunchroom and this person who's a new person, and, people think that he's kind of funny looking, comes in and he's looking for a friend because he's a new student at the school. Show me what you would do, and if they say, come over here and sit with us, they've now acted out that choice. One thing we know in behavioral psychology is if we want to change behavior, if we want people to do something they've never done before, one thing we can do that will increase the likelihood of that behavior change is to get them to commit in some visible way to that behavior. So if you say, okay, how many people say, I'm going to invite that new kid to my table the next time that happens, and get them to raise their hand, then when they get in that situation, there might be some little voice in their mind that says, you said you were going to do that, this little tug, right? But what's even more effective than that is actually acting it out. Why is that? Because those axons and dendrites in the brain grow together when we do something we've never done before. When we act something out and practice it, new neural connections are formed. That's why practice makes us get better and better and better at something, because those connections get stronger and stronger and stronger until we do it just like that, right? So actually practicing making good choices is what we need to do in fourth grade if we really want to produce that positive behavior. Also, we shouldn't act out making the wrong choice for the same reasons, right? We don't want bad connections to grow together in the brain. So we're going to act out doing the positive thing. Fifth graders are growing in their ability to understand symbols and signs. That makes Fifth grade, an ideal time to take an in-depth look at the sacraments. We need to come back to the sacraments and the rites of the church. I always feel sad for those kids that came to catechesis in second grade, but never got the chance, later on to revisit the sacraments. We have a lot of adults that are walking around with a second grade understanding of the sacraments. And some of those adults decide, well, this is kind of primitive thinking. The church, the church just doesn't think that deeply. I don't believe that anymore, right? But they miss the depth of the church's teaching on the sacraments. They're comparing their second grade understanding with their adult logic, right? What if they were able to dive deeper into the sacraments at different ages, especially in these windows of opportunity, and get a whole new, deeper perspective on those sacraments, right? I don't think they would walk away quite so easily in that case. Fifth graders are also in a stage of identity development in which they begin to seriously consider who they will be when they're older. So the social scientists have identified 2 ages where kids are most likely to think about their adult selves. And one of those ages, so, when are they most likely to think of what kind of man or what kind of woman they'll be when they're grown up? One age is age 17, and that makes sense because they're almost young adults as we define it in our culture, right? So at 17, they're getting ready to turn 18, getting ready to graduate high school. Everybody's probably asking them, what do you want to do when you graduate high school? They're kind of hoping they do have some kind of plan, right? And so they get prompted to think about it a lot. But the other age, when kids are most likely to think about their adult selves, what kind of man, what kind of woman will I be, surprises some people. It's at right around age 11. So most kids turn 11 in 5th grade. Why? Why is that another time when they think about their adult selves? Well, it's a time of very rapid physical growth. And so, they're just beginning to hit puberty. They can't look in the mirror without realizing, I'm not going to be a little girl forever. I'm not going to be a little boy forever. I am becoming a young man, or I'm becoming a young woman. And so they begin to think, what kind of man or what kind of woman will I be? Right? So when we do vocation, so this is a window of opportunity for vocations, is what I'm getting at here. When we do vocations education with kids, we do a lot of that when they're older teens, which is one of those windows of opportunity, granted. But it's probably not the best window of opportunity. It's the next best window. Because by then they already have a plan, right? And they've been thinking about what they want to do. But at 5th grade, they're also thinking about what kind of man, what kind of woman will I be? What if we spent more time talking with them about vocations as 11-year-olds? What if we talked to them about how God has a plan for your life and you can find that plan? God wants to show it to you. He's not going to keep it secret. He wants to show it to you. He doesn't just tell it to us in our ears because he wants us to choose it. And he likes us to discover it. God is a perfect parent. And those of you who are parents, how many of you have ever done like a little surprise scavenger hunt or something with your kids? It's so much fun, isn't it? It's so much fun because it's fun to see their delight as they find stuff and stuff like that. I imagine God is the same way, right? He's a father. And he gives us everything we need to find his plan for our lives, but he makes us work at it. Also, St. Augustine talks about how we appreciate Scripture more because it's hard to understand. Because when we have to dig a little bit, when we have to work at it, we appreciate it more, right? And so when our life's purpose is a little harder to understand, we appreciate it more once we discover it, right? But God doesn't want to keep it secret from us. He wants us to discover it. And if we begin listening to God as an 11-year-old and asking God, what kind of man, what kind of woman do you want me to be? What is your plan for my life? We're much more likely to actually find that plan and not get off track with our own, when we really, really find something that we love, what do we sometimes say? I was made for this, right? We don't always know what's going to make us happy. We look for happiness in all the wrong places sometimes. You remember that old song, Looking for Love in All the Wrong Places? We do that. We look for happiness in all the wrong places. We don't understand what's going to really, truly make us happy, but God made us. He knows what we're made for, and he wants to show us what we're made for. right? We shouldn't be afraid of prompting kids to ask that question. That question, in that song in the Barbie movie. What was I made for, right? What was I made for? Because that's really the path to true happiness for them. Not just pursuing their own passions and their desires, We tell them to follow their dreams, that sometimes their dreams take them nowhere. What's really going to make us happy is doing what we're made for. So, talking about those sacraments at the service of Holy Communion. And, we can do that by really making it a little more concrete, inviting, a priest in to talk about his vocation when he first felt called from God and how. Talking with sisters and brothers, religious sisters and brothers, having them come in and talk with those fifth graders about their vocational journeys. Having married couples come. Marriage is a vocation. It's a vocation fewer people are choosing, sadly, right? And so we want to have married couples come in. And I recommend having an older couple that's been married for 30 years or more, because some kids have never seen that anywhere in their family. They have intergenerational divorce and separation. Have never seen marriages that last like that. They need to know it's possible, right? Having an older couple that's been married for a long time, and then having a young couple that's just gotten married. So that older couple can talk about what have they learned in their married life together. How have they grown? That younger couple can talk about what are their hopes and dreams for their marriage, and how did they understand that they were called to marriage by God, right? So getting that kind of contact and that experience can be so important for kids at this age. At sixth grade, kids in sixth grade are growing in their abstract thinking ability. And I'm already out of time. Can I go a little bit longer and talk about some older kids? I promise I won't keep you here all night, but we're going to have dessert after this, so I don't want to keep you from dessert, but I'm going to go a little bit longer here. So children in sixth grade are growing in their abstract thinking ability. They've made great strides in reading and writing ability typically at this age, and that makes sixth grade a great time to study sacred scripture and begin to connect the events of salvation history. So there are kind of two extremes of connecting salvation history, and you typically do some of that through typology, because that's such a masterful way to help people understand the connection between the Old Covenant and the New Covenant, to understand that God wasn't just like a certain kind of God for a while and then changed his mind, like this wrathful, vengeful Old Testament God that then became this compassionate God that we see in Jesus. No. Salvation history is a seamless story of the same God and his people and his covenants with his people, right? And when we understand typology, we can understand that a little bit better. We can understand, for example, how the great flood in Genesis is typologically related to the waters of baptism in the New Covenant, right? Or how the Ark of the Covenant in the Old Testament is typologically related to Mary, who the early Christians called the Ark of the New Covenant, right? Who carried the presence, the real presence of God on earth, right? And so we can begin to make those connections. So there are two extremes with this, though. We have people that never mention typology, and people really kind of have this disconnected understanding of the Old and New Covenants. And then we have people that start talking about typology when kids are preschool. There's one particular technique that I like a lot of things about. I'm not going to mention it, but you can probably figure it out. One particular religious education technique that I like a lot of things about, but I have some criticisms of. And one criticism I have is they talk about typology too early, and kids just miss it. They can't make those. They can look like they make the connections, but they're not making the connections because their understanding of this kind of abstract symbolism is just not there yet. They can begin to do that in the sixth grade. And so this is a good time to do that. But children in sixth grade are also becoming young adolescents, so it's an important time to strengthen Catholic identity through the study of our faith ancestors and our basic doctrines. I have some reflection questions there that I will skip right now since we're running short on time. In middle school, physical growth brings a lot of identity issues and questions. Middle schoolers are often, if you remember middle school or if you work with kids this age, very insecure and very self-conscious, right? They're always wondering if they look okay and if they're cool enough and if they're normal and all of that kind of stuff. They're looking for a sense of belonging. They want to see the faith as relevant to them. what does this mean for me? Does this mean anything to me at all? In high school students, they're becoming more independent, and for good reason, because eventually they hopefully are going to be independent. They're going to live as adults on their own, right? And so we, the kind of the pushback and the subtle rebellion of high school years that's pretty typical and normal is developmentally appropriate, because they're beginning to kind of be their own people, and if they have their own, sense of fashion and their own musical styles that they like, as long as it's not destructive for them, those are good ways to rebel. Fine. Your hairstyle looks crazy to me, but you like it, that's fine. Those clothes, I wouldn't dress like that, but if that's how you want to dress, as long as it's not immodest, that's fine. And yet, I think that if we try to over control that, we're stifling that natural independence. If we step back too far and we don't stay there as a trusted advisor, then we risk letting them go down rabbit holes that can be very destructive for them. So there's a balance that we have to strike there. Also, kids this age sometimes give us some pushback and a lot of questions about the faith. And, I have mixed feelings about this, because I think sometimes we get really worried when that happens. And we start thinking, oh, no, this is just not sticking with them, or they disagree with the faith. But I'm also conscious of the fact that there are some kids that don't have questions, right? And so when we're with a group of high schoolers and some kids are pushing back a little bit and asking questions, my feeling is there's something very positive about that, because if they're asking questions, at least they're engaged, right? And also, all of us have encountered things. If we take our faith seriously, all of us have encountered things that we struggle with. Part of growth is struggle, right? And so if we've never struggled, I would say to you, and I think I can say this with confidence, if you've never struggled with your faith, then your faith may not be as deep as you think it is. Because there's a point at which we need to struggle. And by the way, St. John of the Cross would back me up on that. Because St. John of the Cross says, if you have this emotional experience of the faith and it's always great for you, well, that's great, but you're a beginner. You're a beginner because until you have really wrestled with your faith, until you've experienced that dark night of the soul where you're thinking, is all of this true? Is there a God? Until you've had to wrestle with that, you haven't quite reached that deepness, that depth of faith, And so those kids in some ways are ahead when they begin to struggle and ask some of these questions. Also, it's reflective sometimes of popular culture, right? So they're getting a certain message in popular culture, and then they say, well, I disagree with church teaching on abortion because it's a woman's right to choose, right? They bought into a slogan, right? And so we can dig into that a little bit, We can talk about that a little more. If all we do is bristle at it, and we say, well, this is what the church teaches. If you don't agree with the church teaches, then you're not Catholic, Well, then we've told them that it's not okay to ask questions and that it's not okay to struggle. And we don't want to send that message. We have good answers for these things. We have good answers for these things, And so if kids pose a question and we're not quite sure how to answer it, or it's like, wow, I was not prepared for that yet today, it's okay to say, you know what, that's a good question. Let's keep talking about that. I'm going to do a little research myself, and we can talk about that more, because I can tell that you're really concerned about this, and I want you to understand what the church teaches about that. That's perfectly fine. We don't have to end the discussion right there, What we want to do is invite them to continue walking with us. One thing that high school students really want, they want to belong. They need to know they do belong. This is their family, right? And so even if there's like a little family dispute, even if they're pushing back a little bit and saying, I don't get this, When they were 2 years old and they were in their family, they didn't understand why they had to go to bed, right? Mom would say, you need to go to bed, and no, right? But you're tired. I'm not tired, right? Every 2 and 3 year old says that, right? Well, there's a point at which sometimes spiritually we don't understand why our mother church teaches what she teaches, right? And we say, no, I disagree with that. We don't kick that 2-year-old out of the house when they say they disagree with the bedtime. We don't kick that high schooler out of the church when they say, I'm not sure about this teaching of the church. We walk with them. We help them understand over time. And sometimes it takes a lot of time, doesn't it? But we always want them to know, you're part of us. This is your family. Keep walking with us. Keep praying about it and thinking about it. We'll keep talking about it. They continue at this age to work on identity issues, and vocations, again, can be presented in this context. It's another window of opportunity for that. Parents of teens also at this age report high levels of parenting stress. In fact, when they've measured parenting stress, there's actually a measure that they use called the Parenting Stress Index that's considered pretty reliable and valid. When they measure parenting stress, they find that the most stressful time to be a parent is during these years. And that's not a surprise to those of you who've been parents of teens, right? But interestingly, when we have parenting classes, say at a parish setting or something like that, it's almost always geared more toward parents of young kids. Isn't that interesting? So, one thing we might want to consider is what can we do to support more these parents of older kids and teens in the parish who really do need to feel that sense of community. If for nothing else, just to be able to say, no, you tell me that everybody gets to go to Hawaii with their boyfriend for spring break, but I know a bunch of parents of kids your age, and none of them would even think about letting their daughter go to Hawaii with their boyfriend for spring break. Just little things like that, right? So we need that community connection. Okay. As we close here, I just want to mention a couple of things about developmental appropriateness in all of this. So, in my view, developmental appropriateness is multifaceted as well. It means knowing how children develop and learn at particular ages and stages, and creating learning environments that are responsive to those general needs, but also, because every child is unique, knowing the individual children and how they learn best is really essential as well. Just because we know trends and we know windows of opportunity that tend to happen at certain ages doesn't mean every child fits in there. It doesn't mean every third grader is focused on that, or every second grader has now mastered this idea of cause and effect, for example. And then finally, it's also important to know what's culturally appropriate for different ages and stages of development. In a multicultural church and a multicultural community, there are cultural expectations and norms that are different from one culture to the next as well. So we want to be mindful of that. So in my work, in my day-to-day work, I work, as Pam mentioned, with OSV, overseeing the curriculum as an associate publisher. And one of the things that we've really tried to do, as I mentioned, is try to integrate these windows of opportunity into the curriculum that we develop. We have a brand new series called Alive in Christ, Discovering and Sharing the Kerygma, where we've really tried to focus in on those windows of opportunity at every age and stage. And so I wanted to mention, so you get some free books out there that are not this tonight, but if you'd like a free sample of Alive in Christ, and I mean that, it really is free. When I was a DRE at a parish, I used to be afraid to get samples of things because I thought, they're going to send me a bill, or they're going to say, you can keep it for 30 days and then you have to send it back or something. We don't ever do that. So if we send you a free sample, it's free. So if you're at a parish or a school and you'd like a free sample of Alive in Christ or any of our other curriculum, you can scan this QR code and we'll send it to you free. No strings attached. We won't even call you 20 times to see if you want to order it. We'd just like you to see it. So please feel free to do that and to order a sample without fear. If you'd like to get the notes from tonight, you can reach me at jwhite, so J for Joseph, WHITE, jwhite at OSV, for Our Sunday Visitor, OSV.com. Just email me there, and I can send you the notes. I had to kind of skip over a couple of slides pretty quickly, so if you'd like to see what was on those, you can get that from me. And lastly, I just want to say thank you for all the work that you do as Catholic educators in parishes and schools and seminary and all of the places where you might be. you know, sometimes this work um, is thankless work. And I know that. I've been a DRE in a parish and still work in the area of catechesis. But know that you're planting seeds that you might not see the harvest from. But, you know, God says in Isaiah that, that his word bears fruit, that it doesn't come back to him void. So as you plant the seeds of that word, trust that, that those seeds are growing somewhere. And thank you for the work that you do, and God bless you.